Good afternoon, and welcome to the third of three webinars. We're discussing the impact of COVID-19 on food security and the supply chain and economic development more broadly. This afternoon, we'll be focusing specifically, as much as we can, on the impact of government and regulation and cooperation between market participants. My name is Johan Prins. This webinar is made possible with the support of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in South Africa, Enzo Zaden, the NABC, Space. And I'm joined this afternoon by Omri van Zyl, the CEO of Agri SA. Omri, good afternoon. Thank you very much for making the time. There's Omri Menzi Dlamini, who's the Sector Manager at Trade and Investment KZN, specifically focusing on primary sectors, so mining and agriculture. Good afternoon. Thank you for making the time. Jack Fiera, the Agricultural Councillor at the Netherlands Embassy, and Professor Philip Spies, who is Professor Emeritus at the Stellenbosch Business School, specifically focusing on future studies. Professor Spies, I'm going to start with you just to set a little bit of background. We're all focusing on the impact of COVID right now because that's the current crisis. That's the thing that we're trying to find our way through. But South Africa entered this crisis already in a little bit of trouble. If, as you've tried to explain to me in the past, future studies is about seeing what we do with our resource base and looking at the long-term trends in terms of utilization and efficiency. South Africa was already starting on the back foot before the COVID pandemic struck. Can you give us a quick sense on of in the medium to long term what our prospects were before COVID-19, and then we'll look at how COVID has impacted on those prospects.
The sound is jumping around a little bit. I don't know what happened, but anyway, I'll try and hope I will come through clearly.
You are the picture of stability.
Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, now it seems to be okay now. One should remember that South Africa started off as a sort of as a modern nation or a modern country. Based on the mining industry and then the agriculture industry. In the beginning of the previous century, almost 80% of the contribution to the GDP was primary, in other words, mining and agriculture. That changed during the Second World War. When the first major steps were taken to industrialize this country. And it carried on until the 1960s, where after that, it started, the whole development pattern of South Africa started developing serious problems. And we experienced a decrease in economic growth since the middle of the 1970s. With a little bit of a hiccup in 1980 when the gold price went through the roof at that time. Now, the major problem in South Africa is that we have a country that is not really a nation, but I wouldn't say warring tribes, but we cannot settle down to get to work together to find our own problems. In the previous dispensation under apartheid, we had obstructions in the economy, and it was man-made obstructions, and that really hurt the economy to such an extent that by 1990, South Africa was in serious economic troubles. We had a lot of problems at that stage, and sanctions as well as obstructions in the labor market and all kinds of things resulted in a situation in 1990 that we really ended up at the cul-de-sac. We couldn't go further. Then the transition came, and there was high hope that the things in South Africa would change. And during the 1990s, up until the middle of the first decade of this century, we experienced quite excellent growth. The first one was a catch-up game in the sense that what I will say, our macro production function allowed us to grow at the annual real economic growth rate around 3.5%. And during the 1980s, there were a couple of periods where we had negative economic growth. So during the 1990s, with the freeing of the economy, the removal of the sanctions, and the new dispensation that increased the hope in the country, we experienced growth rates around 3% and more for the first time in about 20 real growth rates for the first time in almost 30 years. Over a period of time, and then the commodity boom in South Africa helped us until about the middle of the previous decade, until about 2005 to 2006. Thereafter, we went into a decline to such an extent that we lost our industrial capacity. In our contribution in South Africa, the manufacturing contribution in the beginning of 1990 to the GDP was about 22%, and it's now in the region of 6 to 7%. And why I'm saying this is because the natural destination for people moving away from the mines and agriculture is in the manufacturing business, not in the services business and so on. Now, what we have at this moment in South Africa is a contracting type of situation. We need economic growth rates of around 6%, 5 to 6% to over the long term to create employment. But we had the best we could accomplish over a period of time is about 3.5 to 4%. This means growing unemployment. At the same time, we had an extremely skewed labor force competence structure. Vast majority of people, relative skilled, unskilled, and so on, where there's a small percentage of people, highly skilled people, in terms of the structure of the labor force. It is skewed to such an extent that it became an obstruction to the development of this country. And I will argue that it will almost be impossible for South Africa, under the current situation, under the best situation, to grow in the long term more than the economy to grow more than 3% a year.
Now, if I could just want to clarify this. So you're saying that structurally before COVID, we had a structural limitation on real growth of about 3% per year. The National Development Plan says that we need to be growing at 6 to 7% in order to make a sustainable difference in livelihoods and in social solidarity, etc. And you're saying structurally before COVID, we had rendered ourselves incapable of achieving that objective. Why?
As a matter of fact, at the Institute during the 1980s, we did research on growth rates and employment. And we came to the conclusion at that stage, in the middle of the 60s, 1980s, in the middle of 1980s, that we need at least 6%. So that's quite right. The GEAR target of 6 to 7% is quite. I think it's spot on. Although our population growth declined and our labor force growth declined, but we have an influx from people over the borders, of course, that also created a huge demand for employment over the borders in South Africa, resulting in people entering the urban areas, squatting around the fringes of the urban areas, not being able to find employment or sufficient employment. And I would argue that if you add up all the people that gave up hope of getting some employment, and unemployment probably in terms of the labor force is much nearer to 45%, and I would say that in the youth sector it's probably around 60%, if it's as low as that, the unemployment rate.
Now, if I can just shift the focus a little bit to the agriculture sector again. Before COVID hit, in a brief way, where were we agriculturally, not just in terms of being able to absorb excess labor capacity, but generating economic growth? How were we doing by the end of last year?
The sound is extremely poor on my side. I can't hear what you're asking me.
I will ask the question again. Please. So the question was just in terms of agriculture specifically. By the end of last year, had we put ourselves in a stronger or in a weaker position? If we look at agriculture as a way to absorb labor and also a way to generate economic growth, were we doing ourselves favors by the end of 2019?
You know, I'm going to answer you in terms of what I think you asked me, because it's you're breaking up in the middle of the question, and it's difficult for me to hear it. It's poor. The sound is extremely poor. But as far as agriculture is concerned, we could keep up with the demand in terms of, generally speaking. I think we have, in terms of commercial agriculture, a very healthy sector, And if you look around the world, we have some of the best people in the farming sector doing excellent work with resources that is not comparable to that in the United States and even Australia. Our water resources also is, we're a drought-stricken country, and the way we managed this difficult situation, I think, is outstanding. The problem is not so far as food security is concerned with the current capacity of the agriculture to provide what is required by the population. The problem is, can they afford the food? The problem is unemployment, a lack of money to buy it in the longer term. So we have transfer pricing in terms of the SASSA, the social security payments and so on, and that helps a lot in some of the rural towns. The smaller rural towns are really just alive because of, as I would say, social transfer payments. In many cases, if you go some of the Karoo towns and so on. So our food security situation is more a problem of the general economic situation, and not so far at this stage. At this stage, I must emphasize, in terms of the current capacity, and say in the next 5 to 6 years. What will happen over 10 to 20 years, that's another matter. Because climate change...
We'll try and come back to what's going to happen in 20, 30 years, the longer run. I just want to turn for a second to Omri van Zyl, CEO of Agri SA. Omri, your sense of the impact of COVID on the agricultural industry, is this a short-term blip, or are we looking at a longer-term fundamental change in the way we do business?
Well, I think we're looking at a fundamental way in which we do business in general terms in the economy, not just in agriculture. In South Africa, we are lucky because we have very advanced food value chains. Just on the statistics you asked earlier, last year we produced 127 billion rands worth of goods, and we imported 85 billion. So we're a net exporter of food, and one of the largest producers of citrus, avocados, macadamia nuts, some table grapes, variety of export products. We export 25 of our commodities. So I think in terms of the general food system, we are lucky in that we still have the capacity in place to do that. I think in terms of the main constraints we're experiencing with COVID at the moment is on the consumer side, feed in shops, buying processed goods. I think there's been a lot of panic purchasing around longer term foodstuffs. But I mean, just to give you an idea, South Africa needs about 8 million, 9 million tons of maize. This year we'll produce 14 to 15 million tons of maize. So from a producer's perspective and from a processing perspective, I think we are secure. There are three things that determine food security. The one is the affordability of food, which is what the professor alluded to. And that relates to the whole liquidity in a system, whether that's in South Africa or anywhere else in the world. So if we see a 20% shrinkage in the economy, then obviously the available capital and liquidity in the whole South African economy will be reflected in the consumption and the purchasing of food. The second, of course, is the availability of food, of which I think we have food available everywhere in the country. The third one, which is a social issue, is the affordability, and the quality of the food. So the quality of the food, we benchmark with the best countries in the world. But in the end, it's going to come down to the consumers. It's going to come down to a poor family that spends 60 or 70% of their money on food every month, and how we are going to sustain that system, especially with the embargo on transport and public gatherings, etc. So it will redefine, I think, the way that we do business. But agriculture remains a natural science. I mean, we have to grow things, we have to plant things, we have to harvest them, and we have to distribute them.
There was an article in the news today which received fairly wide coverage, especially on American media, just speaking about production and distribution, where one of the largest pork processing plants in South Dakota apparently has closed down because of an infection hotspot. We haven't seen that kind of thing happening in South Africa yet, but it may very well happen. It may become impossible at various points in the supply chain to operate, not necessarily directly because of the lockdown, but because of COVID infections. How robust is the system at the moment in South Africa?
Well, I think the system is very robust. I mean, clearly the American system is very robust as well. On the processing side, if you talk about abattoirs, you're talking about feedlots, you're talking about congregation of lots of people. The fresh produce markets in South Africa, for example, is obviously of concern, and we're doing our best to try and mitigate the impact of COVID on that. But I think in terms of the protocols that we need to follow, these are being followed as far as we possibly can. But if you're asking me whether we're going to have a COVID situation in labor in this country, the answer is for sure. I mean, it's not even something that it is a statistical, highly statistical probability. But I don't think the food system will stop because of that. The incidents in America I know about, and that shows that's a processing facility. At the moment, the problem in South Africa is we don't sell enough meat, as an example. So the price of the meat is going down. The transport between the farm and the feedlot and the abattoir and the retail shops are constrained, as well as the number of feet in the retail shops and the informal sector. Remember, in South Africa, we have a massive informal sector that we sometimes underestimate, and that is also a big consumer of protein and also of starch. So luckily they've opened that up now. But in that kind of system, to manage the phytosanitary and hygiene requirements is always very challenging.
So this isn't an entirely new kind of challenge. It's just a difference in scale from what we're used to managing.
Yes.
Menzi, I want to quickly turn to you. Your job is to promote trade and investment specifically into KZN. So you have a fairly broad sense of the entire system in KZN specifically. Where do you see the biggest danger points at the moment? Where is the system most likely to take strain if we have an extended lockdown? Menzi seems to have muted himself, or we've muted Menzi.
Was muted.
There we go. You're back with us.
Yes. Thanks. I'll start off with an example. My uncle is a farmer. He farms with vegetables. He's irrigating. So his pump packed up on Saturday. If his pump packed up, it means that he's not going to be able to irrigate. And if the diagnosis is that the pump is really can't be fixed, it will mean that he will have to wait until the people that retail generators or pumps irrigation pumps open for him to be able to start producing. I'm just using that as an example. Imagine if a couple of them, he's a big farmer, by the way, if a couple of them have their pumps fail, which is most unlikely. So what I'm trying to say is, in terms of production, the more extended it is, because of the nature of the restrictions, it might even go into hampering primary production. Because in as much as there is people that have those essential services letters, the guy who's in the pumps is not necessarily at liberty to open up. So one of the things that needs to be zoomed into, what are the other people that are in the value chain in the agricultural industry that may not now be deemed to be essential services? How do we start unbundling those? The mechanics, the guy that is fixing my tractor, is he going to easily get a letter to come and fix the tractor in the farm? Probably not. So we'll have to figure with that. And the other part I think Ombre has hit it on. The moment we have infection in one of the biggest plants, let's say company X that produces poultry or maybe eggs has an infection, and most of these guys that are producing eggs, we're talking big numbers. Let's say it's 200 eggs per day that is supplying maybe Cambridge stores or whatever. So what happens when there's an infection in the plant and the plant has to be closed down? And also in terms of retail and also the market for the goods, if you look at it, yes, the informal traders have now been given their essential letters. But if you look at it, if you look at the figures, the informal sector in South Africa currently has about 2.5. Obviously, the figures are maybe flawed. 2.5 people that are dependent on that. 1 out of 6 of people that are earning income are earning it from the informal sector. So those guys are dependent on high traffic. Definitely, there's no more high traffic. People have been told to stay home. We are staying at home. So who is going to buy the produce? Yes, they have their licenses. And if they were buying vegetables from me as a farmer, I was selling them maybe 20 cases of lettuce that they were retailing on a weekly basis. That market is gone, because maybe 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 per day are going to be getting that lettuce from that lady. So for me, I'm seeing the challenges carrying on throughout the chain up until we get to a point where it is safe to say maybe there's unbundling 1, 2, 3. In this case, the person maybe that the other people, looking at the other people that are participating in the chain that are integral, the support services, the mechanics, and all the other people that sort of contribute towards the production without necessarily producing any goods.
So I suppose one way of thinking about it is, if this thing was simple enough to control and predict, then we could have a planned economy. And the reason planned economies tend not to work that well is because it really is so complicated. It really is that difficult to predict where the pressure points in any system will happen. Does that sound about right, Menzi?
That's correct. There's most of the things that have even unfolded now. It's things that nobody could have easily predicted for them to happen at this point in time of our lives.
Right. So there's a big trade-off, and I think we'll get to a discussion of the big trade-off in a second. Jack Vieira, your job as a councillor for the agricultural sector at the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, how has that job changed over the last 3 or 4 weeks?
Well, yes, that job has been changing quite a lot. Of course, we were continuously building up relationships between Dutch and South African companies, either in direct trade or in research or technology. And of course, now many of the companies are in a kind of survival mode. At least that's what we see in the Netherlands. There's a huge disruption because of COVID, because of lockdowns almost worldwide. There's lockdowns on which affects also the production. And it is interesting to see that on the one side, almost all governments say, please let food production continue and food distribution. On the other hand, there's a lot of challenges, of course, on a company or in a company where you need to take measures to keep social distancing in place, where you see a lot of people that are becoming ill at the same time. So that poses a lot of challenges. Also, the distribution, same point, and that means that there has been huge disruptions in the Netherlands. For example, if you don't look at food, but for example on flour production, that has almost completely come to a stop in 2 weeks' time, and it's a huge business worldwide. Now, also, and I think that is you can see also in South Africa. Because of the lockdown, restaurants are closed, the food services are almost not there anymore. So that means that a lot of your agri production can't go where it used to go. So there's a lot of goods actually that are spoiled now and are wasted because of that. And so that's why I said, there are little requests from companies to do business because they are in that survival mode. That means that we, from that moment on, have received questions, for example, about doing business in South Africa. Are all the companies that do consider them to be agriculture companies, are they performing essential services? In the first week, for example, we got questions on for seed companies, for example, that supply seeds for vegetable production. Are we still able to get our goods at the farms? I think these things were quickly sorted out, but still now we have a lot of questions. For example, in another sector right now, where you have broilers, chicken production, there's a huge disruption in getting one-day-old chicks from abroad, which means that production will slow down. So yes, we see worldwide a lot of changes, and my work has been changed too. In that sense, actually, that in the last 2 weeks, because of the fact that there was not much to do for me except for what I just said, that I was involved merely in evacuating Dutch citizens that were here in South Africa still as a tourist. So that was my main job actually for the last 2 weeks.
Well, I'm glad that you're able to focus a little bit more on agriculture again, and I'm glad you've stuck with us, Professor. I want to come back to you. I think the main political, practical, social question that we will face, South Africa and all other societies, is negotiating the trade-off between locking down so that we slow the spread of the virus, so that we increase our medical treatment capacity on the one hand, and counting the cost and deciding what kind of cost we're willing to pay for that economic slowdown. How should we be thinking about that trade-off? How do we evaluate a decision of such magnitude?
You asked the question to me, I suppose.
Yes.
First of all, of course, how do you value human life? That's an intangible. Can you value human life? But compared to that, of course, you can compare the deaths by COVID-19 vis-a-vis the likelihood of people dying due to an extended economic downturn in South Africa. Now, if we should extend that, we're not in the same boat as Italy or some of the highly developed countries. South Africa is a relatively or absolutely poor country with a large number of people. I would estimate about around 50% of them living in poverty in this country. Now, an extended lockdown on the economy can damage not only economic growth, but also the health of those people. So we have to balance it very carefully. And I would argue that possibly, it's very difficult. This viral infection is something quite unique. It's probably man-made and not of natural origin, if I may judge because of the very nature of it. But if we should extend this, say, up to June or July, I think the the economic and social cost will be tremendous. It will probably outweigh any scenario that the COVID-19 could provide in terms of what's going to happen to in terms of deaths and so on. So what I will argue, and I think I'm not making a prognosis, I'm not making a projection as such. I'm just what they call doing a little bit of backward backcasting. We should ask ourselves what we ought to do, and what we ought to do is to start phasing in economic activity in a very disciplined way, while keeping the policy of social distance and say wearing masks and so on in place for a very long time. School system, that's another thing. Perhaps this is a case today that distance schooling and homeschooling, other technological means will make a major difference in the years to come. We will discover now things that we haven't experienced before in terms of that. So we will have to phase it in, and I would say from the beginning of May, it would be quite necessary to start doing it, to start opening up the economy and to start getting activity going. Hopefully,
we seem to have a little bit of a delay there. My apologies, Professor Omri. If I can turn back to you, one of your key objectives is to represent the industry in the general public discourse and also to government. Your sense of how much longer the industry would be able to tolerate a shutdown. Are we fine until the end of this month? Could we tolerate a shutdown of another month, for instance?
Well, I think we can go on for quite a while. It all will depend on the consumer side of things. I mean, that determines the food chain. But in terms of production, I mean, we are not at risk of not producing what we need. We are at risk of not selling what we are producing. So I think on that side, there will need to be some serious interventions and some drastic action steps from our government to curb the costs of the government expenditure, the state-owned entities, and start looking at ways to fire up the post-COVID economy. I spoke to a bank today who said that they reckon we're going to be minus 20% by the end of the year. And you can imagine what that does to your whole consumer spending and your debt ratios and all of that stuff. This is without the impact on job creation and the growth rate the professor was referring to. So I think we're going to have to push the reset button here and do things differently going forward.
When you say do things differently, apologies, Omri. Let's try and be as specific at this point as we can. What policies should government institute to support, for instance, consumer spending and counteract a rise in prices?
Well, I mean, just from a policy certainty perspective, the first thing that we would need to do is get investment inwards and external investment in South Africa. Just from an agriculture perspective, things like the expropriation of land without compensation is something that's completely ridiculous, given the current requirements of the agriculture sector to keep on producing. We leverage our balance sheets to get money so that we can put that in the ground and so on. So that's the one thing. I think we're going to have to determine where our growth economies and where the quality investments in our economy will be. And we think agriculture is one, because the aggregator of agriculture's employment of people is 4 times higher than any other industry. But then again, there's a lot of vacant land that are not productive. We need industry protection. That's the next thing that we're going to have to do. That's what Japan did in post the World War II, and that's what America, that's what everybody's going to do. We're going to have to lift our tariff barriers so that we buy South African produce. Like, for example, the importation of chicken needs to stop, because if we can stop that, we can sell more of our own chickens, we can sell more maize that's going to go into our own chickens, and we can take control of our own economy. At the moment, those policies don't exist to the extent that. So I think there's going to have to be a radical reset button, and it's not politics as usual. We're in a state where we are going to have to focus on competence, and we're going to have to focus on progress, and I think that's going to be the determinant. If we don't do that, Africa, this disease hasn't caught Africa yet. It's on its way. It's like a slumbering fire and we all know Africa has the worst medical services in the world. We also have massive amounts of weak immune systems and so on. So once this thing gets going, not just in South Africa, but in countries like Zimbabwe, where there's already no money, countries further north, we're looking at a serious pandemic, unless, of course, there's a vaccine that they can develop that you can vaccine yourself with to mitigate this thing. And I think there's a lot of guys working on that. But there's a bigger picture beyond just South Africa, and that's an Southern African picture that is very, very, very dismal.
So the practical, immediate, short term, if you could define for government policy changes to make over the next 3 months, your focus would be policy certainty. So sort out the big political issues that we've been talking about for a long time. Have certainty on those. That would be one thing. Talk to me about the market support you're proposing, because there also is a trade-off between supporting the local market and supporting a lowering of prices. The reason foreign produced chicken is bought in South Africa is because it's often available here at a lower price than locally produced alternatives. So there's a trade-off. Somebody has to pay for that increased cost. Yes.
Yeah. So I think economic protection is not just us that's going to do that. Everybody's going to do that. So everything comes down to the bottom line in terms of an agriculture business, whether that's a farmer or a big agriculture, any agriculture business, it comes down to the bottom line. So you have to manage your overheads, and obviously on the other side, you have to maximize your income. So let me give you an example. In the old pre-94, there was something that they called an agriculture credit board. The credit board extended loans for 30 years. You would get, let's say, an interest rate holiday for 2 years, after which you start paying. That is an example. Tax breaks to lower the barriers to entry for new farming ventures is an example. Those are the practical things that we are looking at and that we are suggesting at the moment. And someone's going to have to, decide. What is our priorities in terms of South Africa's economy? Is it food production, or is it to keep SAA going at a loss rate of I don't know how much? And these are the type of things that I'm referring to that are concrete things that can have very short-term positive impacts on food production, food consumption, and the price of food.
Menzi, I want to just turn to you. We just before this discussion started, we were speaking off air for a second, and you said that there's some difficulty in attracting investment because investors potentially have been for some time asking some potentially difficult questions, and what's happened now is that it's made all of those questions more acute. What policies would need to be instituted? Or what certainty would need to be given for you to be able to attract significantly more investment into KZN, specifically into KZN agriculture in the short term?
It will be difficult to say what specific policies, and remember my position. So it will be just peripheral things that have to be sorted out. At some point in time, an agreement has to be reached with regards to the land issue or ownership thereof, because I think Omre stated it quite perfectly. Specifically in the agricultural sector, when you have land, that is what you use get a loan to, for example, to get your macadamia plants onto the ground, and that is a long-term plant. So my view will be, if we get to an agreement, as you can see, I'm using my words, I'm selecting my words carefully there. So there has to be an agreement on how the issue of land has to be handled in order for us to be able to carry on to be productive, specifically in the agricultural sector. So policy certainty in that area, we have to get them. And also, when you look at structured support in terms of the agricultural industry, I think Omre also highlighted about the credit board that used to be there. Most of the funding that is made available is not as structured as previously it was. Maybe it's because of that gap that happened post-apartheid. To say agricultural industry maybe is predominantly white, the limited support thereof, or if the support is there, is not structured. It's quite encouraging that there's been 12 billion that has been allocated towards agriculture for funding, but is that amount enough? Well, I don't know. So, but in summary, to concretize what I'm trying to say, in terms of the certainty, in terms of the land, we need to get to a point where we are clear in terms of how the land is handled, in order for us to be able to say farmer A or investor A is willing to invest 100 million rands to establish a bioethanol plant that is going to plow to use sweet sorghum. And secondly, what would be the incentives locally to say, for example, you will be funded so much at a certain rebate or with exemption here and there? Because definitely after this, there's a lot of people that will be seated at home without jobs, because other sectors are definitely going to shred jobs more than what the agricultural sector and other key industries will be, in order for us to be able to generate those jobs. Yes, sir.
So, and this is a question for you and for Omri, is where are these discussions happening between industry, between potential investors, between government on a national and on provincial levels? Is there a secret smoke-filled room where these discussions are happening frankly, to say, well, what are we doing in the next 2 weeks? What are we doing in the next 2 years? And then what's the longer term plan?
I think, may I go first, Omri?
Yeah, you may. You may.
Yes. What is happening, the little bit of encouraging news, unfortunately, it's broken down into a couple of sectors. There's already the sugar industry has sat down together with government to put together a sugar industry framework that is going to be used. As you know, the sugar industry is currently suffering in terms of the drought, and they've had to shed a lot of jobs, and the imports and so on and so forth. So in those compartments, it's encouraging that discussions are happening, and private sector and government are having a conversation. Also, there's the recent poultry industry framework as well, where discussions are being held in terms of turning around the industry specifically. The contents thereof and the merits thereof, we wouldn't want to get into those specifics as it is now. But in my view, those conversations are currently starting to happen in combat forms in terms of the poultry, the sugar, and I'm hoping it's going to spread throughout the entire agricultural value chain.
Omri, are you having more productive discussions with government?
Yes, we are, Johan. We part of a technical committee that advises the minister and the DGs on strategies to revitalize the industry from a number of angles. And I must be honest, the minister has been quite receptive to our suggestions and some of the things that we've said. Having said that, you know, it's not, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just business as usual. I mean, just to give you an idea, you know, the value of our farm and assets in South Africa is about 450 billion rands, and we borrow against that. We borrow about 200 billion, of which the land bank is the largest contributor. So So there's also a little reset button that we would have to push in terms of lending criteria and access to finance. But we are in constant communication with the department and with the National Command Center about this.
There's on the comments to this discussion, there's an interesting suggestion from Tsepo Maeko, who we spoke with last week. And specifically for you, he says, shouldn't we fast track the linkage of the fresh produce market supplies to emergency COVID-19 relief aid being purchased by government? Something like that might solve the offset and a little bit of the demand problem. Is that something that you're looking at, or something that you might look at?
Yeah, I think the fresh produce markets are operating very well. The issue is, how do you get the fresh produce to the very rural areas where there's lots of people? So government would have to, in the short term at least, look at some food aid that the army might distribute to them or something like that, because everybody wouldn't get in a bus and go and do shopping, you know. So I think that is one of the key things that government in a state of emergency's responsibility would be.
I have another question here from Maneshri Naidu. She says, we have systems such as BFAP, end-to-end agro-food tracker. What are the gaps with the current systems to deal with the challenges we face? I'm hoping that you can make more sense of that question than I'm able to right now, Omri.
Yeah, the BFAP is the Bureau for Agricultural Policy, and they've developed a food tracker that we use in our 27 commodities to look at where the main constraints are in the food chain, in the logistics chain. At the moment, the constraints that we're experiencing is obviously in the harbors, and with regards to the logistics of getting your produce through the harbors and getting input supplies from overseas back into local markets. I mean, just recently we're going into the harvest season now, and we were importing combine harvesters that needed heavy vehicle licensing, and the licensing departments was closed, as an example. So the only problem with that tracking system is it's not a real live tracking system. One of the problems we have in South Africa, and I think although we are in front in lots of respects, we are not in front in terms of our traceability systems. So livestock traceability systems in South Africa in the pork industry works, but not in the rest of the livestock industry. And that is also something that you can use to actually track and monitor the movement in the food chain.
Mr. Vieira, I have a question. One of the things that the Netherlands government is fairly famous for is the promotion of free trade and open markets. Is there a trade-off to be made now during and immediately after this COVID pandemic, where we may need to accept more state aid, more focus on national self-sufficiency in things like, for example, food? Is that a future that you think is now more likely?
Well, definitely, we will see that in a number of countries around the world. So I think if that's what you mean, we feel that there will be more protectionism to be more self-sufficient. I don't necessarily that is the case in South Africa, because everyone is stating, like Wandile Shilobo, that for now South Africa is food secure. But there will be definitely a number of countries doing that more. And that will have its effects on the worldwide trade. And that's what we also try to prepare for, which means that we are more focusing from our side on, as you may say, selling technology, selling knowledge, and not so much the real product itself. So that is how we prepare for the future, but definitely something that we will see worldwide. Yeah.
So in South Africa's case, we may have some of the knowledge, we don't produce the technology. So as a at the moment a food exporting country, we are dependent for foreign exchange revenue on other countries still buying our product. Do you think that that's going to become that market is going to narrow somewhat, that terms of trade might not go in our favor for the next few years?
I think yes, that might well be the case. I just came across a study that was now done 2 weeks ago by Dutch Rabobank, and maybe it's good to bring that in, because and it's only focusing on one of the commodities for exports. But what they say is, for the coming year, for example, you will see first that there will be a little lower demand, although the internal market will grow a bit, but not enough to compensate the loss that will be the case because of the fact that food services and restaurants, for example, will be closed. That would be the first phase that you have seen, I think, already in many countries. The second phase is that also the demand in supermarkets might be a little bit lower. Why? Because consumers don't take stock anymore. They have already filled up their fridges, so they might buy less in that period. And that's what you actually already see now. That comes also with the logistical problems, financial challenges, etc. And then a third phase they see is that in the end there will be a worldwide recession, which means that the buying power will be reduced, and the prices for farming products will become lower. And actually that is what they forecast for the coming year or 2 years already. So no one knows yet how long the actual crisis now will take. But there will be definitely this will be definitely the case for the next 2-3 years.
Omri, there's an interesting question on the comment segment from Siegfried Jägels, who says, what are the developments around agri-processing innovation, including vertical and urban farming, to reduce supply chain pressure and provide greater access and opportunity for business and communities? Just before you answer that specific question, it sort of goes to a broader sense of we're in a crisis. The crisis is going to be with us for a long time. So we need to be transforming the industry in addition to protecting the industry. And this sort of goes to how can we become more efficient? So I'm asking you two questions, this specific one, and then a much broader question on is Agri-SA driving that kind of innovation, and where do you think that innovation is going to go?
Yes, of course. I think, vertical farming, lucky in South Africa, we have space. So vertical farming generally in places like Holland is a big business because, they can produce a lot more with vertical farming and greenhouses and so on. So that's technology that we are adopting in South Africa. It's also a form of creating food security if they are maintained. So just on the vertical farming thing, in South Africa, it's not big business yet. We have extensive agriculture here because we have space, but it is definitely something that we're seeing. The vertical agriculture guys are members of ours. It's something that is growing. So in terms of the broader adoption of agriculture technology, I think there's a couple of things that we need to put in perspective. The first is all the big international agri-tech companies, seed and chemicals and mechanization are all very, very well represented in South Africa. So we have the likes of Syngenta, of Bayer, that merged with Monsanto, of Corteva, which was a merger of Dow and DuPont. We have BASF. These are the high-tech companies in Switzerland and the States and in Germany that are developing the next generation of agriculture inputs. We also have all the world's biggest tractor companies, crop spraying, all of them are here. Case, New Holland, John Deere, Fendt, you name them. So what the benefit of that is that we get international technology into South Africa that we apply here. Our own research technology in terms of the Agricultural Research Council and the capacity that we have on the government side of the industry has not kept up with global demand. Rabobank was a good example. The likes of Wageningen University these are very high-tech institutions that invest aggressively in agricultural technology. But I think to answer the question, we are a first adopter of technology in agriculture here. We also have, we've got stuff like precision farming. Everybody's doing that. We have excellent genetic material in South Africa. We source it from the best guys in the world. And we also have a lot of these companies that are very heavily invested in South Africa. So I think from that perspective, we definitely are in a good space.
Last question from the floor, Maneshri Naidu again, and I think I will start with Jack. What are some of the lessons we can learn? Do you think what's working well in the Netherlands in dealing with the pandemic? What lessons have you learned from South Africa so far in dealing with the pandemic? And I ask you a really big question with very little time.
It's a really big question, yes. Yeah, I think what we've learned as a lesson in this pandemic is that you really should take the measures which are feasible in your own country. There are very different kind of measures all over the world, and you have really to look, okay, what is working for you? And that's what we've learned. What we've learned, I think, from South Africa is that I think we could have acted quicker in the Netherlands. We had our first case 5-6 weeks ago. And at that time, we didn't have any measures in place, and it took us a little bit more time to do that. And I think South Africa acted really quickly in that respect. So that's what we, I think, could learn from South Africa.
All right, Menzi, I'm going to ask you a big question with very little time as well. We're all treading water a little bit right now in the middle of this crisis. The crisis will end, or we'll have to just live with it for a while. What are the key things that you're going to be focusing on in driving investment, in expanding the productivity of the agricultural sector in South Africa and KZN specifically?
As highlighted earlier, you realize that in general there's been a tapering off in terms of the new investment. So one of the core things that we'll be doing is to ensure that the guys that have already invested expand their investment. Those that have invested, let's say, for example, one of our core priorities is participating as government and ensuring that the sugar industry, for example, doesn't fail because of the job losses that are imminent if that happens. And so are other investments that have already happened. So it is just to say all hands on deck whilst we manage the situation and to ensure that there is no disinvestment or any further job losses from the sector.
I think that on that note, I'm going to end where we began with Professor Spies. Professor, you said at the beginning of this discussion that we've been on a difficult road for a very long time, partially because we weren't able or willing to make the key decisions that would allow us to structurally transform the economy into a better direction. Might this crisis be the shock we needed to start focusing on what's important? Do you get a sense that we're now going to start making the choices that we should have been making for the last decades?
Yes, I think so. I think that when you're fixed in a certain mode of thinking and acting and so on, you need sometimes a crisis to get you out of that mode. I think there will be in South Africa a rethink on economic restructuring. I think that some of the pet projects in South Africa will probably be swept aside. We will be forced to think differently, most definitely, in all sectors of life, from the service sector to the manufacturing sector. I'm just worried that there's an overemphasis on the fourth industrial revolution in South Africa, whereas about 50% to 60% of the South African population perhaps need a second or a third industrial revolution in terms of getting them into the economic system. We have these people living on the border, on the outside of the economic system in South Africa. If we can't get them into this into the new economy, they will remain on the periphery and create all kinds of problems, social and political problems, which will unstabilize the country in the long term. So most definitely there will be or should be a rethink. I think that within a year or so from now, we'll probably see quite significant changes over a broad field in South Africa. Hopefully, we will get this country then again on a developmental mode in economic growth road, but we will have to stop thinking around certain major pet ideas. And I will argue that the fourth industrial revolution is a pet idea, and it's fit for about 20% of the South African population, but it is not the right strategy for 80% of the South African population.
All right, Professor, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of number 3 of our 3 webinars, discussions about the impact of COVID-19 on food security and supply chains in South Africa and the South African economy. I think it's fair to say that we're all still a little bit in shock. We're all trying to work our way through what is likely to be the biggest crisis of our lifetimes. Over the discussions for the last few days, I have been pleasantly surprised by the productive, proactive attitude of participants across the market. We'll get through because there's really no alternative. Thank you to the Holland Business Chamber in Southern Africa for making these discussions possible, along with NABC, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in South Africa, Enza, and to my colleagues at Space for learning a lot of new technology very quickly and getting us on air without too many hiccups. Thank you for your time and your attention and your patience. My name is Johan Prince. Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thanks, Johan.